Okay, so this is Unit 6, and it's actually Topic 7 in your textbook. And what we're going to be talking about is just different economic measurements that can kind of give you an idea of how the economy is performing. And not only that, but to kind of spot where we are in what we call the business cycle. And we're going to look at a number of things here. The first one is GDP. So as you look at this, we use a system, economists use a system called national income accounting to monitor the U.S. economy. And so what they do is they just collect a bunch of data. Usually the Department of Commerce will then put this all together into what we call the national income and product accounts. And the main thing that they are going to look at is a thing called GDP, which you can see in red here. This is the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given year. Now we say final goods because this is what the consumers actually buy. When you're talking intermediate goods, these are things that businesses might buy to help them make the final goods. But by looking at final goods, the cost of making those will include all those intermediate goods and such. So that's why they're going to look primarily at those. Now, there's two different ways to calculate GDP, and as you can see up here, we have the expenditure approach, which is going to look at basically what is spent to make the product by the producers. And then you have the income approach, where we're going to add up the incomes of everyone involved in making the various final goods within our country's borders. And you can see on the chart here that you're going to end up with basically the same value for GDP. Now, a lot of times we would say that the income approach is a little bit more accurate because it includes a lot more as it calculates those incomes versus the expenditure approach. Now, the ways that we measure GDP, we have what's called nominal and real GDP. Nominal GDP is simply going to be calculating those final goods in current prices. It's a good way to measure. It gives you a good snapshot of the economy, exactly where we're at and how things were. But when you're trying to look at GDP and adjust for things like inflation, or to compare, let's say 1970 to 2017, you're going to, have very different variables in the economy. Maybe we don't produce the exact same things in 2017 that we did in 1970, different size workforce and these sorts of things. So by putting GDP into what we call a constant and establishing a base year when you calculate it, what you're able to do is get what's called real GDP, and it gives you a little bit more consistent measurement to go on, and you're not having to constantly recalculate it every time prices change like you might have to do with nominal. Now, GDP, like I said, is the dollar value of all final goods and services within a country's borders, and you can see here that it includes the cash value of goods and services sold and offered to consumers and any company producing in the U.S. It does not include the cost of producing goods and services, the immediate goods, although, like I said earlier, they're somewhat figured in. And then, of course, any U.S. company producing overseas would not be included in GDP. So GDP doesn't include four things: any non-market activities, everything from babysitting to mowing the yard, or just things you take cash for that aren't reported. A parent watching their own kid produces actually a great service to the rest of us, but it doesn't get reported. There's things called the underground economy. This could be for illicit activity like drugs and other activities like that aren't going to be recorded to the U.S. Commerce Department and that sort of thing. Or it could also mean just little cottage industries that maybe aren't reported because you make so little and you sell things out of your home. There's also negative externalities or side effects that we learned about in Unit 1 or 2, which are going to be things like, what's the value that you place on someone, cleaning up trash near a river that doesn't necessarily get reported. And then GDP, just because we have a high GDP doesn't necessarily mean quality of life. So we don't measure things like happiness and those sorts of things, but GDP is not really meant to measure that, so that's okay. And you can look here, the spending by category. Where we spend most of our money typically is housing, which would explain why 2008 was such a bad year when we had the recession and the housing crisis, how it affected the entire economy. So you can look at that chart. Now, once you know GDP, there's a number of things you can actually calculate. And so if you take GDP and add income earned outside the U.S. by U.S. firms and citizens, so now we're including those U.S. companies overseas, and then subtract out any non-U.S. firms here in the U.S., that's what we're going to calculate what we call GNP, or gross national product. If you take that amount, subtract out depreciation of capital equipment. Remember, capital is the human-made resources used to create goods and services, one of our factors of production. If you take out, just the idea that the value of that equipment goes down with its use, you can get what's called net national product. Take net national product, and there's a number of factors that we won't really go into for this course. And if you make those adjustments, both positive and negative, you will get what's called national income. Now that helps us figure some other things out. For instance, we can take what people get in reinvested profits, income taxes, Social Security taxes, other household income, and find out what the average personal income is, subtract out what people actually pay in individual income taxes, and find out what people's disposable personal income is, what they have to spend after all these things are subtracted. Now, factors that affect GDP are going to be what we call aggregate supply and aggregate demand, what we've learned before. When supply is high, for instance, there would be no need to produce a whole lot of goods until we sell the goods we already have. So when you're looking at the aggregate supply, the total amount of goods available for sale in the country, that might actually cause us to slow down production. So when we measure GDP in times with high supply, you're going to have a lower GDP because we're not as productive. On the other hand, if demand is high, and it's going to mean that prices are probably rising, then you're going to see aggregate demand cause us to want to produce more, which would then in turn lead to a higher GDP. And of course, this market's trying to get back to equilibrium, so there'll be adjustments here and there that will affect things as well. Now, this leads us to what I mentioned earlier with the business cycle. And this is kind of what the business cycle looks like, but what we mean by the business cycle is just a period of macroeconomic expansion. This is when it's moving up in the drawing there. It'll hit a peak, the highest place where real GDP stops rising, and then it has to start falling. It's just the ebb and flow of it, the ups and the downs of the economy. The trough that you see there is the bottom point, and that's where real GDP stops falling, and of course will then turn around and start rising again, repeating the cycle. Now, what you'll see during these phases, expansion, you'll see rising GDP, so that total value of all goods and services being produced in a country's borders in a given year will be rising and increasing. You'll see unemployment dropping. Typically, inflation might be problematic here at times, depending on the level of expansion. And then contraction's the opposite. You're going to see real GDP falling, unemployment rising, businesses not making investments, and things like that. And you can see what drives the business cycle there at the bottom. External shocks, meaning things we don't expect. Could be war, could be famine, could be disease, could be just natural disasters like Hurricane Harvey, had a huge effect on things. But this is the normal ebb and flow. How long these things last, we don't know. Some expansionary periods can last years, months, weeks, sometimes contraction the same. Contractions that go on a terribly long time are what we call recessions. And so if you see real GDP falling for 2 consecutive quarters, at least 6 straight months, we start calling that a recession. Usually that lasts 6 to 18 months, and then if it gets deeper or worse and continues to drop, we'll call that contractionary period a depression. And now the worst one that you could actually have would be stagflation. This is where real GDP is declining, so you're not producing as much, but at the same time prices are increasing. And so you could think about Germany after World War I for historical example there. Just forecasting business cycles, it's guesswork. A lot of times hindsight's 2020, but we try to look at these things like GDP, like the unemployment rate and things to try to kind of figure out where we are in this business cycle. And so you can kind of go through this and see kind of a good example of how this all may come together. Now, GDP is going to be influenced by population. Greater population to maintain a standard of living, we're going to have to produce more, but we're going to have jobs. We're going to have the ability for people to work and be productive, to get paychecks, to be able to go out and purchase items so that we can then continue to make those goods. Capital deepening is an issue where you're going to see capital being purchased for each worker with these firms. And when you see companies willing to buy more capital and invest in their capital items, it's usually a good sign for the economy. Savings is another thing that you can kind of get a good sense of. When money's able to be loaned out by the banks, it stimulates the growth. And that leads also to the capital deepening because they're able to then give that money to businesses. And you can see a good example here how saving money, whether you just save it in a normal bank account or if you put it into an investment like stocks and bonds, mutual funds, it's still going to get out there and work. And so one of the things we want to look at here is the effects of population growth, government, and trade all kind of have an effect. And so, all this stuff comes into play in terms of how productive we are as a nation. Technological progress is something that can lead to economic growth. And so technology, one, helps us produce more, better, quicker, faster, more efficiently, not wasting those resources. But as that happens, usually the cost of production will come down over time. You think about any technology, it's very expensive at the beginning, but eventually you have even, what we would say the most economically disadvantaged having access to a lot of these things. I mean, think about how many people just have, smartphones right now. Considering their cost, it's pretty amazing how we've been able to see that filter down to everybody. So technological progress is a big thing. Now, unemployment is going to be something we always want to look at, how many people are actually working. Now, this is calculated looking at what we call the civilian labor force. Not everyone out there is part of that. You have to be 16 and over, non-military, to be considered in the civilian labor force. But not everyone chooses to work either. And so this would be the formula for calculating the unemployment rate. There's 4 types of unemployment, which you can see at the top. A college student who doesn't have a job but just graduated but is looking for work would be what we call frictionally unemployed. Structural unemployment is very important. This is why we'll never have 0% unemployment, because you're always going to have people looking for work, and the jobs that may be available that they need people for require a certain amount of technological or educational level of skills that maybe you don't have. And so, when you have that lack of education for that job, for instance, brain surgeons, there may be tons of openings for it, but very few people to fill it because it's a huge commitment, not only financially to go to school, but also to spend 10 years or more in the medical field training. So seasonal unemployment would be things like Six Flags and snow cone stands and things that are going to shut down for a time. Teaching is one of those seasonal unemployments during the summer and that sort of thing. And cyclical ties to the business cycle. When people are laid off because of an economic downturn in the economy, that would be cyclical unemployment. So 0% is not really achievable. So if it's between 4 and 6% unemployment rate, we say that is fully employed because you don't have any cyclical unemployment. Like I said, you'll always have structural. So underemployment, people working jobs which are overqualified, or they're working part-time but they really want to work full-time but they can't seem to get full-time work. And then we have discouraged workers, people that have given up looking. Those would not be included in the unemployment rate. So if those people started looking for work all of a sudden because they are encouraged, you might see a spike in the unemployment rate for a time before it levels back off once they find work. So again, this is the calculation of the unemployment rate, and done by the U.S. Bureau of the Census for the Bureau of Labor. And usually 60,000 families a month are contacted through a questionnaire and to calculate that. All right, inflation affects purchasing power. This is just rising of prices, and so we're going to look at what's called a consumer price index. Whenever you see index, just kind of think average. So what we'll do is to calculate if prices are rising, we won't look at every single good being purchased or produced, but we will look at what we call a market basket, which is just kind of a select group of products that the typical urban consumer buys. And the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, again, looks at this to calculate that. Causes of inflation, either too much money in the economy, growth of the money supply, we call that the quantity theory. Changes in aggregate demand. Demand might be pulling prices higher. Or the cost of producing is going up, and so therefore prices follow eventually. So this can lead to what we call the wage price spiral, and you can see that in the chart on the right-hand side. A lot of times inflation is just hurting the purchasing power of consumers, and so if they can't buy as much, then they have to make cuts, and then that's going to affect businesses who aren't getting as much business because of that. Hyperinflation would be a term you need to know, where you're just going to see out of control inflation, usually 100 to 500% per month. Money's losing its value that way. All right, last thing we want to look at is poverty, and just the idea that people that make income lower than what we call the poverty threshold, this is determined by the government, and the percentage of people below this line, this line that the government establishes for a household income, is what we call the poverty rate, the percent of people that are under that line. Now, in the 90s, you had President Clinton actually signed something called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 to try to get people off of welfare and more into what we call workfare. Just the idea that you couldn't just sit at home and collect a check. And so it was kind of a callback to the New Deal in some ways, but the idea that you wanted to get people out working and trying to look for those jobs to encourage the economy. We're trying to get equity, but when we give out welfare, this is government aid to the poor, and you have to qualify by being under that threshold. There's going to be two types of welfare. In-kind benefits, this is where you give out actual goods or services for free or at reduced prices, like government housing, subsidized housing. Legal aid when you can't afford a lawyer, food stamps, Medicaid, and those sorts of things. And then finally, cash transfers, where you actually give checks. That'd be unemployment checks, Social Security checks, workers' compensation when you're hurt at the job. And you can see a number of things there in the chart that we've passed to try to fight poverty in the United States. So that when the government's seeing that the economy is hurting the average person, they're going to take steps to intervene. And those are some of those programs that the government has. So that's basically an overview for Unit 6. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me through Canvas.